Rain dresses the stones, and a carriage stops at Pembroke House. An orphan steps down, Lillian Harcourt, carpetbag in hand, a modest brooch at her throat, and a secret poised to change a duke's life. Inside, Alistair Pembroke breaks a fallen friend's seal, a warning of vultures circling the girl's name. In rooms lit by fire and judgment, one choice sharpens, duty to reputation, or desire that refuses silence. A past returns, a ledger whispers, and a hidden seam begs to be opened. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me where you're joining us from, and what captures your heart most in period romances. The slow burn glances, the forbidden vows, or the truth, finally unmasked. Bath, England, the year of our Lord, 1815. The rain had fallen steadily since dawn, cloaking the city in a veil of grey silk and making the ancient stone of Pembroke House appear even more austere than usual. Inside its walls, the scent of damp wool and firewood clung to the air, and the flicker of gaslight danced across the high-panelled corridors like whispers of another time. A carriage groaned to a halt before the grand entrance, its wheels sinking into the wet gravel. The horses pawed the ground restlessly as the door swung open, revealing a figure whose very presence seemed at odds with the opulence that awaited her. Lillian Harcourt stepped down slowly, one gloved hand clinging to the doorframe for balance, the other clutching a modest carpetbag. Her dress, a travel-worn gown of grey-blue muslin, clung to her slender frame, its hem frayed and dampened by the long journey from Hampshire. A faded straw bonnet shielded part of her face, but it could not hide the determined set of her jaw, nor the flicker of anxiety in her hazel-green eyes. She was but 19 years of age, orphaned, alone, and yet she carried herself with a composure that did not match her circumstance. From the drawing-room window, Alistair Pembroke, Duke of Pembroke, watched her arrival with quiet intensity. He was a man of 33, tall and severe in bearing, with eyes the colour of storm-washed slate and a countenance carved by duty. A man unaccustomed to disorder, least of all when it arrived wrapped in threadbare elegance at his doorstep. "She's younger than I expected," murmured Lady Augusta Pembroke, his aunt, standing at his side in layers of dark plum velvet, her silver hair swept into a crown of tightly coiled braids. Her tone was crisp, unimpressed, and plainly not prepared for Bath. Alistair said nothing. His gaze did not leave the girl. There was something in the way she paused at the threshold, as though summoning the last of her strength before facing a world that had already dismissed her. It stirred something beneath his well-armored reserve. Moments later, the great door opened, and the girl was ushered inside by the butler, who eyed her carpetbag with visible hesitation. Rainwater dripped from her skirts, pooling delicately onto the marble floor. "Miss Lillian Harcourt, Your Grace," the butler announced, his voice betraying a hint of apology, as if he feared her presence might offend the portraits on the walls. Alistair approached. For a breathless moment, Lillian lifted her eyes to meet his, and the world narrowed to silence. Her expression was guarded, but not meek. She did not curtsy. Instead, she inclined her head with quiet grace. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Thank you for receiving me." He nodded, motioning toward the drawing room. "You're welcome here, Miss Harcourt, at least until we settle your affairs." Lady Augusta bristled faintly at the remark, but held her tongue. The fire snapped in the grate as they entered, casting warm shadows over Lillian's damp figure. She sat carefully on the edge of an embroidered chair, posture straight, despite the weariness clinging to her. Her hands rested primly in her lap, one of them still grasping the small oval brooch pinned to her collar. Alistair's gaze caught on it. "That piece," he said, his voice low. "Was it your mother's?" Lillian looked down at the brooch. It was modest, gold-rimmed with a pale blue enamel center weathered with age. Her thumb brushed over it absently. "She wore it always," she replied. "She used to say important things are best hidden in plain sight." Lady Augusta's brows rose at the remark. Alistair, however, stilled. The girl's eyes returned to his. "It's all I have left of her." He studied her closely now, not just the weariness, but the steel beneath it. The strength it took to arrive unchaperoned, to enter a duke's house and sit straight-backed and dry-eyed after burying both parents. Later, when Lillian was shown to the guest chamber, small, though not ungenerous, Alistair returned to his study, where a sealed letter waited on his desk. The parchment bore the mark of his late friend, Major Edward Langford, who had fallen in the peninsula mere months ago. He broke the seal. "Alistair, if this reaches you, it means I have failed in the one promise that mattered. Take care with the girl. There are vultures already circling her name. The Hollywell accounts are not what they appear. Trust no one who comes for her, not even blood." The letter ended with a scrawled note. "She carries the truth. Just look closer." Outside, the rain deepened. Inside Pembroke House, the hearths blazed with warmth. Yet a storm of a different nature had already crossed the threshold. And somewhere upstairs, Lillian Harcourt stood before a gilded mirror in a borrowed room, unpinning the brooch from her dress. Her fingers lingered over its edge, pausing, then pressing lightly, until a hidden seam gave way, revealing something tucked within. But she did not open it. Not yet. Not tonight. The morning mist lingered over the cobblestones of Bath like a silk shawl forgotten in haste, casting the elegant city in a veil of intrigue and moisture. The great dome of the pump room gleamed faintly beneath the pale light of the overcast sky, while the chatter of well-dressed matrons and gentlemen echoed from the colonnade, mingling with the faint strains of a string quartet playing near the fountain. Society, in all its elaborate finery, had gathered, as it always did, to see, to be seen, and above all, to observe with interest any deviation from the expected. And on that morning, the most talked-about deviation arrived in the form of the Duke of Pembroke, arm in arm with a young lady not of their circle, not of their kind, Lillian Harcourt. She walked beside the Duke with a quiet dignity that defied her plain attire. Her gown, though recently mended and newly pressed by the Pembroke staff, lacked the opulent embellishments favoured by the young ladies who flitted past them with swishing skirts and sparkling brooches. A pale lavender ribbon tied at her waist was her only ornament, and her bonnet, neat but unadorned, cast a gentle shadow over her face, allowing her to gaze upon the opulence around her without meeting too many direct stares. But she felt them. The glances, the whispers, the slight intake of breath when her hand lightly touched the Duke's arm as they passed into the pump room, the pause in conversation when they entered the hall, the shift in posture, as though the air had grown heavier with scandal and curiosity. "I do not believe I've ever seen her before," murmured one lady behind a fan of ivory lace. "An orphan, they say," replied another, "taken in by the Duke himself. Why not send her to relatives, if she has any?" a third offered, voice dripping with feigned concern. "It's most unorthodox, most unwise." Alistair, for his part, appeared unbothered. His expression remained carved in noble calm as he guided Lillian through the throng. He introduced her to no one, nor did he offer explanation. In that he protected her, but also fed the flame of speculation. Lillian kept her gaze forward even as her cheeks burned beneath the bonnet. She had never been in a place so filled with elegance and expectation. The ceiling soared above her, coffered and painted with faded frescoes, while the columns lining the chamber stood like silent judges. The scent of lavender water and rose powder clung to the air. She did not belong here, and yet she walked. It was only when they reached the central fountain that the air shifted from quiet tension to overt hostility. A familiar voice rang out, sweet as sugar and sharp as glass. "Your Grace, what a pleasant surprise." Lady Eugenia Carraway stood by the marble basin, her hand resting lightly upon the arm of a younger cousin. Her gown was a confection of periwinkle silk and white lace, the bodice cut just daring enough to draw the eye without reproach. Her Her blonde curls had been arranged into an artful cascade, and a string of pearls encircled her slender neck, like a noose of perfection. Alistair bowed his head in polite acknowledgement. "Lady Eugenia, I see you've brought a companion." Her blue eyes settled on Lillian with the warmth of frost. "How refreshing to see your grace engaging with the less fortunate. One must admire such charitable spirit." Lillian felt the words pierce her chest like pins beneath the skin. She did not lower her eyes. She would not. The Duke's voice, calm and low, held a note of steel. "Miss Harcourt is under my protection, Lady Eugenia. I would ask that you remember your manners." The corner of Eugenia's lips lifted, but it was not a smile. "Oh, indeed. Manners are everything. And bloodlines." Her gaze flicked back to Lillian. "Tell me, my dear, are you enjoying your first season, or is this more of a visit?" "I'm not here for the season," Lillian said, her voice steady, though her pulse thrummed in her ears. "Nor for amusement." "Ah," Eugenia tilted her head. "How rare that must be." Alistair stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the two women. "We were just leaving," he said curtly. Lady Eugenia's smile remained fixed. "As you wish, Your Grace, but do remember our last conversation. Some alliances, long considered, should not be cast aside so easily." She turned, her silken train whispering across the floor, and was soon enveloped by her adoring circle. Lillian said nothing until they reached the steps outside. The light had grown stronger, but her shoulders felt heavy. "I apologize," Alistair said quietly. "You were insulted. I should not have brought you here." Lillian shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. She simply reminded me of my place." He stopped walking. "No," he said with a quiet finality that made her meet his gaze. "She attempted to define your place. That is not the same thing." Something in her chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with the strange ache of being seen. That afternoon, Lady Augusta Pembroke awaited them in the drawing room, seated like a queen amid velvet cushions and ancient books. The fire crackled softly beside her, and her silver spectacles rested on her lap. "Well," she said without preamble, "the gossip has begun." Alistair remained standing. "It began before she arrived. Then let us not feed it further." The older woman folded her hands. "You must send the girl to her relatives. The longer she remains here, the greater the damage to her name and yours." Lillian stood silently by the hearth, her hands clasped. She had not been invited to speak, but the heat in her throat demanded release. "My relatives never wrote to me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not once, not when my mother died, not when my father fell ill. Only after I was left alone did a letter arrive, from a family I have never met, who never cared." Lady Pembroke looked at her for a long moment. "Nonetheless, they are her kin." "Are they?" Alistair said, voice sharper than before. "Or are they something else entirely?" Lady Augusta's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I received a letter from Langford," he said, "before his death. He warned me that not all who claim ties to Miss Harcourt are acting in good faith." Lillian lowered her gaze to the brooch at her throat. She pressed it lightly with her thumb, an unconscious gesture now. "I believe," she said slowly, "that my mother hid something in this. She used to say important things should never be left where thieves might expect them." Lady Pembroke studied the girl for a moment longer before rising to her feet. "I will not argue further today," she said, "but I urge caution. Bath does not forget scandal." She left the room in silence. That evening, as dusk gathered across the hills and lamps were lit one by one across the city, a knock echoed from the front door. The butler reappeared minutes later with a card held delicately between gloved fingers. "Mr. Silas Graydon, solicitor," he announced, "wishing to speak with the Duke regarding Miss Harcourt's custody." Alistair turned toward the window, his jaw set. "Show him in." And with that, the quiet storm brewing within the house turned its gaze outward to the shadowed streets and the man who had come to claim the girl no one had thought worth protecting. But the girl was not a mere orphan, And the Duke was no longer simply a guardian. The rain had ceased by morning, but Bath remained cloaked in a fine mist, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sunlight, when it did appear, filtered faintly through pale clouds, illuminating the drawing room of Pembroke House with a melancholy golden sheen. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the Duke's study, where silence reigned like a sovereign. Alistair Pembroke stood at his desk, one hand resting on the sealed envelope that bore the name of Major Edward Langford, his oldest friend, his fiercest companion in war, and now a ghost whose final words had travelled across months and oceans to reach him. He broke the wax slowly, almost reluctantly, and unfolded the letter with care. The ink had faded in places, but the hand was unmistakably Langford's, bold, slanted, confident even in farewell. Alistair, if this reaches you, then I have failed in the one vow I never meant to break. You'll have received the girl already, or you soon shall. She is more than she seems. She is not merely the daughter of my friend. She carries with her a truth worth more than any title or estate. But there are those who would see her stripped of it. The Fentons are not what they claim, nor is their interest in her born of kindness. You must protect her until the truth is safe. There is a trust, Holywell, that her mother once administered. Hidden money, silent accounts. If you find the ledgers, you'll find the motive behind the vultures. Trust no one who comes to claim her, not even those bearing her blood. And if she still wears that brooch, look inside. The Duke read the letter twice, then a third time, his eyes lingering on the final instruction. He reached for a small silver box resting on the mantel, the one where Miss Harcourt had placed the brooch the night before after retiring to her room. With delicate care, he opened it and held the piece in his palm. It was modest in design, a small oval, pale blue enamel framed by a rim of tarnished gold. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a keepsake, sentimental but ordinary. Yet when he pressed the edge along the bottom, a faint click answered him. A seam, nearly invisible, gave way to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, folded with precision, lay a scrap of parchment, fragile, yellowed with age. He drew it out and unfolded it slowly. What remained was only a portion of a larger certificate, but the name was unmistakable. Clarissa Fairchild, married at Holywell Parish to Edward Langford. Clarissa Fairchild, not Clarissa Harcourt. And beneath the name, in smaller looping script, a notation of an infant born the following spring. Alistair's breath caught. She was not merely the child of a friend, she was legitimate, though under a name concealed by time and circumstance. And if Langford had known, if he had kept her hidden, then there had been reason enough to fear for what others might do with that knowledge. He sat heavily, the letter in one hand, the brooch in the other, and stared into the flames. The game had shifted, and so had the stakes. Later that afternoon, Lillian asked to take a walk. Her voice was polite, but tinged with something restless, an urgency of spirit that Alistair recognized. It was the ache of confinement, of being watched, measured, whispered about. He granted her leave and sent a footman discreetly a few paces behind. The streets of Bath were alive with motion. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, ribbons fluttered from bonnets, and laughter spilled from the tea rooms lining Milsom Street. But Lillian did not linger in fashionable places. She walked with quiet purpose through the narrower lanes until she reached the gates of the Bath Charity Hospital. It was not grand. The building bore the wear of age, its windows streaked and its stones dulled by decades of soot and rain. But its doors stood open, and the scent of carbolic and boiled herbs wafted gently into the air. She paused at the threshold. The sounds within, low murmurs, the clatter of pails, a child's soft cry, called to something in her. Without hesitation, she stepped inside. A nurse with tired eyes greeted her and offered no protest when Lillian requested to assist, even if only to read to the children or hold their hands. Within minutes, she found herself seated beside a boy no older than 6, feverish and fretful, his skin pale and damp. She wiped his brow with a damp cloth and whispered stories of warm meadows and apple trees, of boats that floated down rivers with sails made of stitched linen. Her voice, low and melodic, calmed the child until his eyes fluttered shut. It was in the corridor beyond the infirmary that she noticed it. The ledger. It lay open upon a desk, its entries lined in neat columns. Something about the notations caught her attention. A string of numbers repeated at intervals, donations labeled as private, but recorded under initials she recognized from letters once seen in her father's study. There was a pattern. She leaned closer and studied the handwriting. Her brow furrowed. She knew that hand. "I used to help my mother with her ledgers," she whispered aloud, as though reassuring herself. "I was no more than 10, but she always said numbers never lie. They only wait to be read." As she stood, a voice called softly from behind. "You read well." Lillian turned. Lady Pembroke stood at the end of the corridor, watching her with arms folded and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "I did not expect to find you here," the older woman continued, stepping forward, "nor reading ledgers." "I didn't intend to intrude, ma'am," Lillian said quickly. "I was drawn to the children, and then I noticed something that seemed curious." Lady Pembroke looked past her at the open book. "You read accounts." "My mother taught me," Lillian said. "She managed the household herself for years. After my father fell ill, she kept careful records. She used to say that a woman who can balance a column can guard a legacy." A flicker passed over Lady Pembroke's expression. She looked at Lillian for a long moment, then spoke, quieter this time. "Come, there's something I wish to show you." Back at Pembroke House, in the smaller salon reserved for informal afternoons, Lady Pembroke opened a drawer and retrieved a small primer. It was a children's reader, well worn, the cover scuffed with age. "There is a maid," she said, "who cannot read. She has served this house since she was a child herself. Would you help her?" Lillian smiled, surprised and grateful. "Yes, gladly." That evening, as the lamps were lit and the scent of roasted chestnuts drifted from the kitchen, the butler returned with a folded card. "Forgive the hour, Your Grace," he said to Alistair, "but this was delivered by hand." Alistair took the card and unfolded it. A name was written in crisp black ink. Mr. Silas Graydon, solicitor of the Fenton family. The note requested a meeting, a matter of guardianship and immediate transfer. The Duke's jaw tightened. The vultures had begun to circle in earnest, and the truth Lillian carried, folded in parchment and memory, was no longer safe in silence. The carriage clattered through the narrow lanes of the city, its wheels muffled by the early morning fog that hung low and stubborn across the cobblestones. Lillian sat still in the corner of the velvet seat, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed beyond the misted glass as unfamiliar streets unfurled around her like the pages of a story she had no wish to read. Her dress, simple, dove-grey and modest, seemed out of place against the crimson velvet upholstery of the Pembroke carriage. Though a footman had tucked a wool shawl gently over her shoulders, she felt no warmth. Not from the shawl, nor from the day ahead. Mr. Graydon sat across from her, upright and silent, his posture so precise it seemed carved from stone. The solicitor's dark coat and immaculate gloves suited the cold gleam in his eyes that had scarcely met hers since he'd announced the morning appointment. "You will be introduced to your mother's kin," he said brusquely when they first departed. "The Fenton family has generously agreed to assume guardianship until a formal arrangement can be settled." Lillian had said nothing. What argument could she make without proof, without position, without power? As the carriage slowed, her breath caught in her throat. Before them loomed a house of white stone, tall and narrow, with wrought iron balconies that jutted from shuttered windows like the ribs of a corseted body. The Fenton townhouse stood proud upon a quiet square, its polished facade gleaming with prosperity. Yet there was no warmth in its symmetry, only chill and calculation. The door opened before they reached the steps, as if the inhabitants had been watching. A butler in green livery nodded at Mr. Graydon and barely glanced at Lillian. Inside, the air was heavy with lavender oil and beeswax, and the floors gleamed so brightly that Lillian hesitated to walk upon them. The silence in the house was unwelcoming, as though each clock tick and rustle of fabric was judged and measured. She was led into a drawing room, where heavy crimson curtains dulled the morning light, and every surface glittered with objects too ornate to be beautiful. There, seated upon a chair carved with gilded swans, was a woman who exhaled elegance and disapproval in the same breath. Mrs. Agatha Fenton. She rose slowly, her silks rustling like dry leaves. Her hair, streaked with silver, was arranged in a style far too youthful for her age, and her fingers bore rings that seemed more like trophies than adornments. "So," she said, drawing out the word like a sigh, "you are Clarissa's girl." Lillian curtsied politely. "Yes, ma'am." "You have your mother's mouth," Mrs. Fenton replied coldly. "Too wide." She was always smiling at the wrong time. There was a pause, as if that insult required silence for appreciation. Then the woman turned toward Graydon. "She may stay in the upstairs room, the smaller one, until we decide what's to be done with her." That "we" settled over Lillian like a weight. Breakfast was served in the next room, though only Mrs. Fenton and Mr. Graydon took their places at the long table. Lillian was given a tray, dry toast, a boiled egg, no butter, and shown to a corner by a maid who never met her eye. She sat in silence, the clatter of cutlery and porcelain echoing like judgment. At last, Mrs. Fenton rose. "Come with me." They ascended the grand staircase, their footsteps muted by a runner of embroidered wool. Lillian followed obediently, though her hands trembled at her sides. At the threshold of a small, dim chamber, Mrs. Fenton turned and reached for the brooch pinned at Lillian's collar. "Let me see that." Instinctively, Lillian stepped back. "It belonged to my mother, I'm aware." Clarissa was a fool to cling to sentiment. She disgraced the Fairchild name by marrying beneath her, and now you expect to benefit from the very blood she turned her back on. Mrs. Fenton's tone was rich with contempt, but her eyes betrayed something colder. Calculation, greed perhaps, or fear. "I expect nothing, ma'am," Lillian said softly. The woman's hand hovered, then withdrew. "You'll learn your place soon enough." She left the room without another word. It was nearing midday when the knock echoed through the foyer of the Fenton house. A servant opened the door and froze. The Duke of Pembroke stood upon the steps, his coat damp from fog, his gloves removed, eyes narrowed not in anger, but in resolution. Behind him, the Pembroke crest gleamed on the carriage door like a challenge. Mrs. Fenton appeared swiftly, lips drawn in a smile that never touched her eyes. "Your Grace, how unexpected." "I've come for Miss Harcourt," Alistair said, stepping into the entryway without waiting for permission. Agatha's smile tightened. "She is being cared for appropriately. We have every intention of—" "I've spoken to a registrar at Holywell Parish," he interrupted. "It seems the Fenton family once managed the estate, known as Holywell, and that you were relieved of those duties under delicate circumstances." The colour drained from the woman's face. "I've also learned," he continued, voice low and precise, "that Mr. Graydon was the solicitor responsible for the accounts during that time. A curious coincidence, is it not, that both of you now appear so eager to claim a girl whose name was never worth uttering until funds were involved?" Mrs. Fenton tried to gather herself. "You have no right to accuse—" "I have every right," Alistair said quietly, "as her guardian, appointed by the will of Major Langford, and as a peer of the realm. And if you attempt to take legal action, I will ensure a full audit of the Holywell accounts is opened. Let the Crown decide where guilt resides." Behind him, Lillian appeared at the top of the staircase. Her eyes widened with disbelief and something far more fragile, hope. Alistair met her gaze, and in that single moment, the silence between them spoke of trust unspoken and protection promised. Graydon appeared in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "You risk scandal, Your Grace. Interfering with lawful placement. Do not mistake me for a man concerned with scandal, Mr. Graydon," Alistair replied. "I've faced fire, blade, and betrayal. I will not be cowed by paper." As he turned to leave with Lillian at his side, he passed a small table near the doorway, its surface carved with the family crest of the Fentons. Subtly, he drew a leather-bound notebook from his coat, and shielding his hand, copied the mark with quiet precision. It might prove useful. Later, back at Pembroke House, Lady Pembroke stood in the corridor, arms crossed, lips pursed. "This cannot go on," she said firmly. "You risk your name, the girl's reputation, everything we have." "I would rather risk everything," Alistair replied, "than abandon her to those jackals." His aunt studied him, her expression unreadable, then turned and walked away in silence. And in the library beyond the corridor, Lillian stood in the window light, the brooch safe once more upon her chest. She watched the pale sky shift above Bath and felt, for the first time in days, that perhaps she was not entirely alone. By the second week of April, the spring rain had softened the corners of the city, washing soot from the stones and coaxing pale blossoms from the hedgerows. But beneath the bloom and sunlight, a darker current had begun to swell. The city whispered. It began with a look, a glance too long, too sharp, shared between two matrons outside the milliner's. Then a murmur at the tea room, cloaked in civility but laced with poison. Soon the murmurs gathered strength, weaving their way into conversation like invisible threads. The Duke of Pembroke, once the golden son of Bath, was keeping an orphan girl under his roof, unmarried, unchaperoned, and worst of all, unclaimed. Mr. Silas Graydon, solicitor and silent puppeteer, had unleashed a campaign not with proclamations, but with insinuations. It was not his name that passed from lip to lip, but the questions he had carefully seeded. Was the girl truly an orphan, or something more scandalous? Had the Duke lost his sense of propriety? And what could a man of such power possibly want with a girl of no fortune? The effect was swift. Invitations once frequent and flattering no longer arrived. At the assembly rooms, acquaintances who once greeted Alistair with warmth now offered stiff nods or looked elsewhere entirely. At dinner parties, his name evoked polite silence. Even his valet noted that tailors and wine merchants now required payment upon delivery. Lady Pembroke, though outwardly composed, seethed in private. "They are jackals," she hissed one morning, tossing a copy of the Bath Gazette onto the table. "Starving for scandal, eager to feast on the reputation we have guarded for generations." Alistair folded the paper without reading it. "Let them feast." "Let them—" "Alistair, your title is intact," he said firmly, "and will remain so." But it was not pride that stiffened his spine. It was something more fragile, more dangerous. The image of Lillian, standing by the firelight in the library, the brooch gleaming at her throat, the same fire that had once danced in Clarissa's eyes. She was not merely a ward, she was the last thread of a promise, and unknowingly the key to something far greater. Yet he also knew the weight of a scandal left to rot, and so, to protect her from further scrutiny and himself from temptation, he placed Lillian in a cottage on the outskirts of the city. The cottage, Pembroke owned and rarely used, stood just beyond Prior Park, nestled at the edge of a wooded rise. It was modest in size but finely appointed. Polished floors, well-kept hearths, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet garden where hyacinths and snowdrops bloomed in defiance of the cold. Discreet and respectable, it offered sanctuary without disgrace. Lillian said nothing when he showed her the key. She only looked at him, eyes wide with the weight of understanding, and whispered, "Thank you." She did not ask if this was exile. She already knew. In the days that followed, she walked each morning into the heart of Bath, never accompanied, never late. She no longer dined under gilded ceilings or read poetry by the fire. Instead, she worked. The Bath Charity Hospital, overwhelmed as always by illness and poverty, accepted her presence without question. The nurses, worn and overburdened, quickly saw in her a natural hand and a steady spirit. She sat beside coughing children, changed linens, helped boil herbs for poultices, and she read books to the illiterate, scripture to the dying, letters to the forgotten. It was during one of these quiet evenings, seated in the office where ledgers lay forgotten beneath dust and dried ink, that she noticed it. A name, or what should have been a name, written only in initials. BG. The amount was small but repeated. A monthly donation, privately delivered, always in coin. The pattern tugged at her mind. She flipped back through the ledger, fingers smudged with ink, eyes narrowed. There it was again. BG, always under the same hand. Always in the same precise script. Not the hand of the current administrator, but familiar. She opened her small satchel and withdrew the scrap of certificate hidden in the brooch. She had only looked at it twice since its discovery, out of both reverence and fear. But now, under the yellowed lamplight, she placed it beside the ledger and compared. The slant was identical. Her mother's hand. Clarissa Fairchild Langford had written these entries. Her pulse quickened. Hollywell. The trust. The accounts. Her mother had been involved, deeply enough to leave traces behind. But how had the money fallen into the hands of the Fentons? And why had her name vanished from the history? She began copying the entries into her journal, carefully, methodically. The next morning she returned to the hospital, her hands still ink-stained, her thoughts unraveling a tapestry of theft woven under the guise of charity. Meanwhile, Alistair remained in Bath, bearing the brunt of society's disapproval with the dignity of a man long accustomed to solitude. Though his presence was still noted, it no longer inspired admiration. When he entered the assembly rooms, silence followed. When he passed the windows of the fashionable tea room, heads turned and fans fluttered. One afternoon, as he prepared to leave his club, a footman approached with a note, folded, unsealed, the paper of common quality. He opened it. Only one sentence was written in ink, jagged and bold: "Return the girl or fall with her." He read it thrice, then folded it again and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. That evening, he rode out to the cottage. She opened the door before he knocked. Her dress was simple, her hair pinned loosely, and her cheeks flushed with the heat of the hearth. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. "I discovered something," she said breathlessly. "In the hospital ledger." He stepped inside. The door closed behind him with the quiet finality of fate. She placed the journal on the table, showing him the copied entries, the initials, the pattern of theft. "My mother's hand is there," she whispered. "She wrote them. She managed the Hollywell funds. I am certain of it." Alistair ran his fingers over the ink, the page still warm from her touch. "You've done more than many men would dare," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with resolve. She was not a fool. She hid what she could, and now someone is using it to silence me. His hand hovered over the journal. Then, with great care, he reached out and covered hers. "We will not be silent," he said. And in the quiet cottage at the edge of the woods, with the fire crackling and the rain beginning once more beyond the windows, they stood side by side, two souls caught in the eye of a storm neither had summoned, but both were prepared to face, together. Twilight had descended upon the city in a hush of gold and ash, the last threads of light casting a warm melancholy over Pembroke House. Within its stone walls, long shrouded in cold propriety, the atmosphere had changed. A quiet urgency stirred the air, as if time itself had begun to thrum with something that refused to be silenced. In the smaller library, far from the prying eyes of society, two women sat across from one another, with papers spread between them like the pieces of a forgotten puzzle. One wore velvet and pearls, the mark of a Duchess Dowager. The other wore wool and modest cotton, the mark of a girl the world had tried to discard. Lady Augusta Pembroke, once a woman ruled by tradition, now leaned forward with spectacles perched upon her nose, scanning a column of notations in a ledger copied by Lillian's own hand. Her silver hair was pinned in precise coils, yet there was a softness about her now, one not born of weakness, but of reluctant admiration. "Your mother was clever," she murmured, tracing a faded entry with her gloved finger. "She used different initials each quarter to disguise the movement of funds." "She had to be," Lillian replied, voice low. "She was entrusted with money that others wanted to steal. She told me once that safety lies not in hiding what's precious, but in making others believe it worthless." Lady Pembroke's lips curved faintly, a philosophy I once underestimated. They worked late into the night, piecing together fragments, numbers, names, dates. Lillian's memory of her mother's handwriting filled in gaps where the paper had worn thin. Augusta's knowledge of family histories, estates, and financial customs provided context. Together, they began to see the shape of something damning. The name Fenton appeared twice, once as a steward, and once, more damningly, as a recipient of a private estate disbursement signed under a false title. The signature was bold and theatrical. Agatha Fenton, the woman who now dared call Lillian an inconvenience. Lady Pembroke leaned back slowly, her fingers steepled. "This is enough to raise questions, but not to convict." "Then we must find the rest," Lillian said without hesitation. "The original ledger, the real one. My mother always kept two." Augusta met her gaze. "And where, pray, do you suppose this elusive book is hiding?" There was a pause, and then, as if spoken from a dream, Lillian whispered, "Sydney Gardens. Graydon has taken to attending every event there. Masquerades, suppers, private rooms above the gallery. It's where the money changes hands, where secrets move with the wine." The old woman's brow lifted, her voice dry. "You intend to attend a masquerade, with your reputation already teetering on the edge of ruin." "Reputation," Lillian replied, eyes steady, "will not feed justice or truth." The silence between them was not disapproval, but recognition. By the following evening, preparations had been made. Lady Pembroke summoned a seamstress under pretense of needing a new morning gown. What emerged instead was a mask of black lace and a gown of deepest emerald satin, simple in design yet rich in presence, borrowed, stitched, and reshaped from Augusta's own youth. A duchess's gown repurposed for war. Alistair, upon hearing the plan, had said little, only that he would be there, watching, protecting. The night of the masquerade arrived, like a secret whispered across the city. Lanterns hung in strings above the gardens, glowing like stars trapped in silk. Music spilled from the pavilion in waves of violins and harp, and laughter, artificial and manicured, floated beneath masks of porcelain and feathers. Lillian entered beneath a cloak, her breath shallow, her heart steady. Her gown shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, the fabric whispering with each step. She was no longer the orphan in grey. She was a shadow among shadows, unseen, unknown, and for the first time, unafraid. Inside, opulence reigned. Gilded mirrors reflected 100 costumed figures, their identities concealed, their ambitions bared. Wine flowed. Laughter cracked like glass. And behind the laughter, beneath the dancing, Lillian searched. She found Graydon near the East Gallery, masked in black, his mouth curved in a smirk that betrayed nothing. He spoke to a man she did not recognize, a clerk, perhaps, but his hand gestured subtly toward the second-floor salon, where private business was often conducted. She waited until the corridor was empty. Then she ascended the marble stairs. The room was locked. She withdrew a small pin from her hair, her fingers trembling only slightly. Her mother had once shown her this trick, laughing as she'd opened a chest of old letters. "One must never be without a key," Clarissa had said, "especially when the door leads to truth." The lock gave way. The salon beyond was dimly lit. lined with paintings of dubious taste and a large desk tucked into the far corner. On the desk, a chest of iron and brass, no larger than a jewelry box, but heavy enough to speak of secrets. She opened it. Inside, a ledger, torn, frayed, but unmistakable. She turned the pages, and there it was, the full entry, payments diverted, signatures forged, names repeated again and again. Agatha Fenton. The air shifted. She turned. He stood in the doorway. Alistair, not in a mask, not in disguise, but fully himself. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "I had to be," she replied. "We've found it." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, unspoken and undeniable. Not love, not yet, but its first breath. And then a voice, mocking, familiar. "Well, isn't this charming, Eugenia?" She stepped into the corridor, a red satin mask pushed to her forehead, revealing triumph in every line of her painted face. "A thief in satin," she said. "How poetic." Lillian moved to speak, but Alistair stepped between them. "Leave," he ordered. "This does not concern you." "Oh, but it does," Eugenia purred. "I saw her break into the room. I saw her with the ledger, and I will speak of it. I will shout it through the assembly rooms." Graydon appeared behind her, calm and ready. "Let the authorities decide," he said. "After all, theft is theft, even when done with noble hands." And just like that, the masquerade fell silent around them. A scandal had been staged. And Lillian Harcourt, orphan of no name and every truth, was suddenly no longer the one watching from the shadows. She had become the spectacle. The prison beneath the Guildhall was not designed for comfort nor for justice. It was built for silence. Its stones were soaked in centuries of dampness and secrets, and its walls echoed with the faint drip of water from unseen cracks. The scent of mildew clung to the air, mixing with the bitterness of old iron and the weight of unspoken truths. Lillian Harcourt sat alone on a narrow bench, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the cold. She wore no bonnet, no shawl, and her emerald satin gown, so recently the height of stolen elegance, now looked out of place, like a dream that had turned against her. The lace cuffs were torn where hands had gripped her arms too tightly. Her brooch had been taken upon arrival. Still, she held her chin high. The constable, a man well past middle age, with a lined face and tired eyes, stood near the bars, observing her with cautious curiosity. He had seen many young women weep, beg, curse, but she had done none of those things. She had confessed. "I acted alone," she had said. The Duke knew nothing. She had said it calmly, clearly, without tremor or hesitation. Now, seated in the quiet hour before dawn, she listened to the sounds of the world above. Boots on stone, horses snorting in the street, the muffled toll of the hour bell. Time, which had always belonged to others, now belonged to her in the cruelest way, to count, to wait, to endure. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother's hands, slender, quick, always ink-stained. She remembered her mother's voice, low and warm, teaching her to read ledgers not as columns of coin, but as maps to truth. And she remembered her mother's silence when the letters stopped coming, when the money vanished, when hope grew thin. If she must now pay the price for uncovering those secrets, she would. The iron door creaked open. She opened her eyes slowly. Alistair stood there, taller than the cell's shadow, his coat heavy with the cold of morning, his gloves clutched in one hand. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw anger, fear, and something far more dangerous. Devotion. "Why?" he asked, voice low. "Why would you lie?" Lillian rose. "Because they would come for you next, and I will not be the reason your name is dragged through the streets." "I care nothing for my name," he said, "but I care for justice, and for you." He stepped closer to the bars. His hand reached for hers through the space between them. When their fingers touched, the warmth was immediate, grounding, unspoken. "There was a time," he whispered, "when I believed that reputation was everything. That a man's worth could be measured by his silence, by how well he guarded what was his. And now I would trade it all, he said, his voice breaking, to see you walk free. A sound from the corridor broke their moment. He turned sharply. Lady Pembroke entered, dressed in a dark cloak, her hair bound tightly beneath a modest bonnet. There was no grandeur in her posture, only gravity. "I have spoken with the magistrate," she said. "He will allow you to present your evidence tomorrow at the Guildhall." "There is no point," Lillian said softly. "They have the ledger. The brooch is gone." Lady Pembroke lifted her chin. "Then we shall give them more." She stepped forward and looked at Lillian, truly looked at her, not as a girl of no consequence, but as a woman standing in the path of ruin. "I once loved a man," Augusta said. "He was a violinist. Poor, brilliant. He made me laugh at a time when I had forgotten how. But he was not of my rank, and I was a Pembroke. So I married a duke, and I played my part." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Do you know what I regret, Miss Harcourt? Not the pearls I wore, not the carriages or titles. I regret that I let the world choose for me, that I buried the best part of myself in silence." She stepped closer to the cell, her eyes fierce now. "I will not watch another woman be broken by that same silence." Alistair reached into his coat and withdrew 2 items. The first was a sealed envelope, the certificate fragment, carefully restored, mounted beside a note in Langford's hand. The second was the ledger page, smuggled from the masquerade before the arrest. "They prove your mother's name, your inheritance, the theft." Lillian looked at him in wonder. "How?" "I am not as helpless as I appear," he said gently. The constable unlocked the door. The iron groaned. Lady Pembroke stepped aside. "You will stay with me until the hearing," she said. "They will not touch you again." Outside, the city was awakening. Dawn spilled across the cobblestones in streaks of pale gold. Shops opened their shutters. Chimneys breathed out curls of smoke. Life resumed, as it always did, indifferent to the lives it trampled. At Pembroke House, the servants stood silent as Lillian entered at Lady Pembroke's side, escorted not as a prisoner, but as a guest. In the drawing room, warm with firelight, Lillian sat once more before the mirror where her mother's brooch had first caught the Duke's eye. She touched the space at her collarbone where it used to rest. Augusta appeared behind her, holding something in her palm. "The constable returned it," she said quietly. "He claimed it had no legal value, only sentimental." She placed the brooch in Lillian's hand. Lillian closed her fingers around it, the metal still warm. There was a knock. Alistair entered, holding a fresh letter from the magistrate. "The hearing is set," he said. "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock." She rose slowly. "Then everything will be decided." He nodded. Everything, but neither of them moved. They stood close, not touching, yet bound by something stronger than any contract. In his eyes, she saw not a duke, not a protector, but a man who had chosen her when the world had demanded her surrender. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you stand with me?" He bowed his head, his voice rough. "To the end." Outside, the bells of the Guildhall began to ring. One day left, one chance to reclaim what had been taken, and nothing, not fear, not scandal, not silence, would stop the truth from rising. The bells of St. Michael's rang 9 times, their solemn chime echoing through the honey-coloured streets of Bath, like the tolling of fate. By 10 o'clock, the Guildhall stood silent no longer. Its great wooden doors had been thrown open, and the drawing room, usually reserved for civic declarations and mundane court affairs, had been transformed into an arena of judgment. A sea of faces, powdered, perfumed, and poised with curiosity or disdain, filled the rows of polished benches. Men in tailored coats and women in silks crowded elbow to elbow, feathered fans twitching, eyes darting toward the dais where the magistrate sat beneath a crimson banner. The room held the hum of expectation, a collective breath not yet released. At the center stood Lillian Harcourt. She was dressed not in finery, but in quiet defiance, an ivory gown with no embellishment save a delicate line of lace at the collar. Her hair was gathered neatly at her nape, her shoulders straight, her chin held high. The brooch rested once more at her throat, gleaming faintly beneath the lantern light, like a seal of truth reclaimed. To her left, Duke Alistair Pembroke, stern and still, stood with the grace of a man prepared to surrender everything but the truth. Behind them, Lady Augusta Pembroke, her spine as rigid as a sword, regarded the room with frost-bitten disdain. And then, like a shadow slipping through sunlight, Lady Eugenia Carroway entered. Draped in a gown of blood-red velvet, her mask now cast aside in favor of a visage sharpened by resentment, she moved through the crowd like a queen without a throne. Her eyes scanned the chamber until they landed on Alistair and did not waver. The magistrate cleared his throat, calling the chamber to silence. The room obeyed. "Miss Harcourt," he said, peering over his spectacles, "you stand accused of unlawful entry, theft, and attempted misappropriation of financial records. Do you wish to speak?" Lillian stepped forward. The weight of the room settled on her, but her voice did not falter. "My name is Lillian Harcourt, daughter of Clarissa Fairchild Langford and Edward Langford. My mother once served as steward of the Holywell Trust, managing funds meant for charitable purposes. After my parents' passing, I was left in silence. My name was hidden, my rights forgotten." A murmur ran through the room. "I have spent the last months trying to understand why," she continued. "Why I was erased, why no one claimed me until it served their interests." She paused, glancing toward Eugenia, who offered only a tight-lipped smile, and then toward the Fenton solicitor, seated stiffly on the edge of the aisle. "I volunteered at the Bath Charity Hospital. There, I recognized my mother's handwriting in the ledgers. I uncovered a pattern, donations redirected, names falsified. What began as curiosity became discovery. What became discovery became danger." Her voice deepened slightly. "And yet I was not afraid, because I carry my mother's blood. Because I refuse to be forgotten." Silence, then a single clap. It stopped abruptly when the magistrate raised his hand. "Lord Pembroke," the magistrate said, turning, "do you corroborate these claims?" Alistair stepped forward. His voice was colder, quieter, but it struck like steel. "I do." He drew from his coat a folder bound in twine. He placed it on the table before the magistrate. "In this folder," he said, "you will find copies of a trust ledger once maintained by Clarissa Fairchild Langford. You will also find a document bearing a seal used by the Fenton family, copied by my own hand during a visit to their home. This seal appears on papers that suggest false claims of stewardship, signatures traced and affixed to accounts long closed." He paused, letting the tension build. "Miss Harcourt broke no law. What she did, what we did, was unearth a truth buried beneath years of theft." The magistrate opened the file slowly, reading in silence. The court held its breath. In the corner of the room, Silas Graydon shifted. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands white-knuckled against his cane. "I should like to call a witness," Lady Pembroke announced. The room turned in unison. "Lady Augusta," the magistrate said, blinking. "I have lived in Bath for over 30 years, she said coolly. "I have seen reputations built and destroyed with frightening ease, but I know a liar when I see one." She turned her eyes directly upon Graydon. "This man," she said, "sought custody of Miss Harcourt, not out of charity or duty, but for access to her name. He coordinated with the Fentons, who once lost stewardship of Holywell due to impropriety, to manipulate the trust for personal gain." She drew a final paper from her reticule. "This is the original receipt of disbursement. It bears Agatha Fenton's signature, applied to funds that were meant for charity. I oversaw the original endowment with my late husband. I recognized the misused crest." Gasps filled the room. The magistrate held up his hand again. His eyes scanned the document, then narrowed. "Mr. Graydon," he said sharply, "do you wish to respond?" But Graydon did not speak. Instead, he turned to leave. "Stop him!" came a shout, and the guards at the rear doors stepped forward. Graydon was seized before he reached the aisle. He did not struggle. He simply stared at Lillian, and for the first time something flickered in his eyes, not fury but disbelief, as if he had miscalculated the one thing he never thought could undo him, a woman with nothing to lose. "Let the record show," the magistrate said gravely, "that the evidence submitted discredits all accusations against Miss Harcourt and confirms embezzlement by Mr. Silas Graydon in partnership with the Fenton family." The air seemed to shift like the release of a long-held breath. "Effective immediately," he continued. "The Fentons are stripped of their remaining stewardship responsibilities. All estate claims by Mrs. Agatha Fenton are to be revoked pending further review." A murmur of approval rose in waves, followed by scattered applause, more heartfelt than decorous. Eugenia rose from her seat, her face a portrait of icy devastation. She did not speak. She did not glance at Alistair. She turned and left, her exit as silent as her ambitions' collapse. Lillian stood motionless, her heart pounding, her breath caught in the cage of her ribs. It was over, but not entirely. Later, as the chamber emptied and the air cooled, Lillian stood near the great window overlooking the square. The sunlight caught the edges of her dress, casting shadows upon the marble floor. She turned slowly as Alistair approached. "You did it," he said. "No," she replied softly. "We did it." His expression softened. "Then why do you look ready to vanish?" She smiled faintly. "Because even now, I wonder if staying would do more harm than good. Your name, your world, it was never meant to carry mine beside it." He stepped closer, his voice low. "And yet it carries it already." She turned away, unsure, unsettled. He did not press further. Instead, he bowed his head. "I will not force your hand, Lillian. But if you leave, do so knowing this. I do not want a future shaped by the rules that tried to break you. I want one shaped by the woman who survived them." She said nothing, but her hand drifted to the brooch at her throat. And in her silence, the first seeds of her next decision quietly took root. The morning after the hearing dawned, not with the roar of victory, but with a quiet that felt heavier than any applause. A pale mist crept over the rooftops of Bath, softening the lines between certainty and doubt, between what had ended and what might begin. The city, always watchful, had awakened to the aftermath with keen interest. But within Pembroke House, the atmosphere was hushed. Lillian stood by the library window, fingers resting on the edge of the pane, watching as spring attempted to assert itself. Green tendrils curled along the garden walls, tentative buds opened beneath the morning dew, and somewhere in the distance the cry of a vendor drifted faintly on the breeze. Yet within her there was no bloom, only stillness. She had been vindicated, her name cleared, her bloodline restored, and yet the weight in her chest had not lifted, because she knew the truth. Reputation could be returned, but trust was never owed, not even when love hovered near. Behind her, Lady Pembroke's footsteps were soft but purposeful. "He is at the Crescent," the older woman said, without preamble. "He walked there early, as he used to when he was a boy and needed to think." Lillian did not turn. "And what is he thinking now?" Lady Pembroke sighed, long and low. "He is thinking what all men of pride and lineage must think, when their hearts begin to war with their heritage." Lillian looked down at her hands. "Then I have brought him nothing but conflict." "You have brought him the only thing he has ever been denied," Augusta replied, stepping closer. "A reason to choose for himself." She placed an envelope on the writing desk beside Lillian. "This arrived this morning, from the trustees at Holywell." Lillian opened it with careful fingers. Her eyes skimmed the contents, and her breath caught. "They've recognized the documents," she whispered. "The trust has been restored. To me. Not as a favor," Augusta added. "As right. You are no longer dependent on Alistair's name or protection. You stand alone." Lillian's throat tightened. "And yet, that may be the very reason he walks away." The older woman did not answer. She simply touched Lillian's shoulder gently and left her in the silence of her choosing. By the time Lillian reached the Royal Crescent, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the grand curve of golden stone bathed in soft light. The gravel path crunched beneath her boots as she crossed the green, her pace slow, uncertain. The air smelled of earth and hyacinths, of possibility and hesitation. She saw him before he saw her. Alistair stood at the far end of the garden terrace, one hand resting on the iron railing, his posture as still as marble. He wore no hat, his dark hair tousled by the wind. The lines of his coat were perfectly pressed, but his face bore the fatigue of a man who had lived 100 battles in a single week. When he turned, his eyes met hers at once, and something in them shattered. "Lillian," he said, as if the word had been waiting behind his teeth for hours. She stopped a few paces away. The distance between them felt unbearable, too wide for strangers, too narrow for what they might become. "I didn't expect you here," he said quietly. "And yet here I am," she replied. He looked down, then away, as if gathering his strength. When he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all armor. "I was raised to believe that duty came before desire, that a duke must guard his name, his estate, his alliances, that love was secondary, or worse, foolish." She listened in silence. "But then you came," he said, eyes locked on hers. "You and your quiet strength, your fire, your unwillingness to bow even when the world demanded it. You unsettled everything I thought I knew." He stepped forward. "I do not ask for your hand to save you, Lillian. I ask because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. Not as a burden, not as a secret, as my wife, my equal, my choice." Her breath trembled. "I don't want pity," she whispered, "or gratitude, or the weight of obligation." He reached for her hand, and when his fingers touched hers, they closed slowly, reverently. "You want love," he said, "and I give it to you, freely." Fiercely. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not cry. She stood still, her heart pounding with the enormity of the moment. She had lived a life where choice had always belonged to others. Now it belonged to her. But before she could answer, a page came rushing up the path, breathless and clutching a folded paper. "Your Grace," he said, bowing. "Urgent correspondence from the Bath Gazette." Alistair took the letter and unfolded it. At the top, printed in bold black type, the headline screamed its triumph. "The Duke has chosen, not rank but heart beneath it, the story." A public letter penned by Alistair Pembroke and submitted that morning, formally breaking all ties with the Carraways. The phrasing was precise, unapologetic. "Let the world know," it said, "that I cast off old alliances not for scandal, but for honor. I choose not a name nor a dowry, but a woman whose courage makes her nobler than any title. I choose love, not for what it gives me, but for what it allows me to give." Lillian's eyes filled with astonishment. She looked up at him, lips parted. "You wrote this?" "I did," he said, folding the paper. "Before I knew what you would say, before I had the right to hope." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And if I say yes?" His smile broke slowly, like light after a long storm. "Then I will spend the rest of my days proving that you were right to do so." She nodded once, tears slipping quietly down her cheek. Then she did the most scandalous, the most impossible, the most perfect thing. She took his hand, and together they turned toward the future, unwritten, uncertain, and gloriously theirs. The bells of St. Swithin's rang out with gentle solemnity, their peals not grand or jubilant, but dignified, echoing softly over the rooftops of Bath like the breath of spring itself. The air that morning was mild and golden, touched by the scent of blooming lilacs and fresh earth, as if the city, long coiled in whispers and judgment, had at last exhaled in peace. Within the small chapel on the northern edge of the crescent, far from the cavernous halls of high society, a quiet gathering had formed. There were no sweeping orchestras, no polished marble aisles lined with nobility, no gossiping debutantes, no parade of titled alliances. Only a few select witnesses, those who had walked alongside two souls through fire and scandal and had chosen, like them, to remain. The bride wore ivory. Her gown was soft in its lines, modest in cut, yet there was nothing plain in the way it fell from her shoulders, or how it clung gently to her frame as though it had been sewn by memory itself. Her hair, dark and smooth, had been swept into a low chignon, a few tendrils curling at her temples in delicate rebellion. And at her throat, nestled beneath the edge of embroidered lace, the brooch gleamed, restored, polished and worn, not as a relic, but as a banner, a piece of her mother, a seal of her truth. She stood facing him, not trembling, not uncertain, but steady, as a woman who had seen what it meant to have nothing, as a woman who now stood not beneath a title, but beside a man who had dared to choose love over legacy. Alistair Pembroke, Duke of Pembroke, wore no insignia beyond the crest engraved on his cuff. No grand medallions adorned his chest, no velvet robes spoke of power, and yet his presence filled the space more surely than any royal decree. His gaze, solemn, reverent, did not waver as he took her hand in his. The vicar's words were gentle, almost whispered, as though not wishing to disturb the fragile sanctity of the moment. When he asked, "Do you take this woman, Lillian Harcourt, to be your wife?" the answer was not thunderous. It did not need to be. "I do." When he turned to her and asked the same, her voice rang clear, like the chime of crystal. "I do." And just like that, without fanfare or indulgence, she became a duchess. But more than that, she became a woman whose name was no longer a whisper behind closed doors, but a vow spoken aloud before the world. After the ceremony, a modest breakfast was held in the garden of Pembroke House. White linens fluttered beneath the arbor, and guests spoke in low voices, not out of propriety, but out of something far more rare: respect. Lady Augusta Pembroke stood tall among them, her silver hair pinned with care, a glass of cordial in her hand. She observed her nephew and his bride with a gaze no longer sharpened by social fear, but softened by a long-awaited pride. At one point, she drew Lillian aside. "The papers are signed," she said, "and the trustees have approved the transfer. The Hollywell funds are now under your management. The scandal has passed, and Bath has miraculously survived." Lillian smiled, touched by the trace of mischief in the older woman's tone. "Then perhaps Bath has changed." Lady Pembroke's eyes narrowed slightly, though not unkindly. "No, but you have." In the weeks that followed, Lillian and Alistair moved swiftly and with purpose. The first act of their union was not to travel or to host, but to build. Using the restored Hollywell Trust, they purchased a parcel of land adjacent to the hospital, land that had long sat neglected and overgrown. Upon it, they began construction of the Harcourt Infirmary and School, a place where the poor could receive care, where girls could be taught to read, where dignity did not hinge on pedigree or coin. Lillian visited the site daily, walking its perimeter with architects, reviewing designs by lamplight, writing letters to benefactors and abolitionists alike. The women of Bath, curious at first, soon began to volunteer. The nurses at the hospital called her Lady Harcourt in secret, though they all knew her title had changed. Yet it was the old name she wore most proudly. One afternoon, while Lillian walked through the newly framed hallways of the infirmary, the sound of carriage wheels interrupted her thoughts. She turned as a liveried footman opened the door to reveal Lady Eugenia Carraway, her figure as polished and poised as ever, though now her eyes carried a brittleness not present before. They stood before each other in silence. "I came to wish you well," Eugenia said at last, her voice clipped. "Though it is not the ending I imagined." Lillian tilted her head slightly. "For either of us." Eugenia's jaw tightened. Society is fickle. They may adore you now, but memories are short. Then I will build something that endures, Lillian replied gently. Eugenia looked around, at the rising beams, the workers' chatter, the scent of sawdust and possibility. You will never be one of us, she said, not cruelly, but with the resignation of a woman who had lost more than she could name. I was never meant to be, Lillian answered. When Eugenia turned and left, she did not look back. That night, as the sun dipped low and cast the city in shades of rose and amber, Alistair entered Lillian's study. He held a small envelope in his hand, the edges yellowed with age. I never opened this, he said. The final fold of Langford's letter. I think it was meant for you. Lillian took it slowly. Her fingers traced the familiar script, her breath catching as she read the words, written in a hand now long gone. You were never a burden, only a light we couldn't deserve. Tears welled in her eyes, not of pain, but of release. She pressed the note to her chest, over the brooch, over her mother's memory, over the woman she had become. As twilight deepened, they walked together through the winding streets of Bath, hand in hand, without guard or pretense. The gaslights flickered on one by one, casting halos of light upon cobblestones still warm from the day. They crossed Pulteney Bridge as the first stars appeared, the river below shimmering like liquid silver. The wind lifted the veil of Lillian's bonnet, and Alistair tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. The brooch glimmered against her throat, no longer hidden, no longer merely symbolic. It was the past reclaimed, and the future freely chosen. The snow had come early that year, settling softly over the rooftops of Bath like a whisper of time gone by. From the high windows of Pembroke House, the world below looked wrapped in lace. Branches dressed in frost, chimneys trailing ribbons of smoke, and the quiet hush of a city that had grown gentler in its watchfulness. The Duchess stood in the nursery doorway, her silhouette framed by candlelight. She watched as a boy, no more than 6, tugged impatiently at the buttons of his woolen coat, while a little girl sat cross-legged on the rug, reading aloud with solemn concentration to a hound far too dignified to interrupt. Papa says snow is good luck on Founding Day, the girl announced, not looking up from her book. Papa also says you take forever to finish your boots, the boy grumbled, glaring at the stubborn leather. Their mother smiled. Enough, both of you. Into the carriage. The guests are already arriving at the infirmary. The Harcourt Infirmary and School, now in its 7th year of operation, had grown beyond anything Lillian had dared to dream. What began as 2 wings and a vision had become a sanctuary. Rooms filled with laughter, learning and second chances. The school served not only orphans and the poor, but also the daughters of merchants and tradesmen, the sons of widows and soldiers. Glass lines blurred beneath its roof, replaced by books, clean linen, and purpose. And today, on its annual founding day, the infirmary would host a winter festival, hot cider, music, a recital by the children's choir. And speeches, of course. Lillian would give one, though she loathed the attention. Alistair, as always, would stand at her side. She found him moments later, seated in the study, a book open in one hand, spectacles perched low on his nose. The streaks of silver now threading his hair had only made him more striking, more certain. His presence still calmed her like no other. "You'll be late," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up and smiled, his eyes warm. "And you'll be perfect as always." She stepped forward and lowered herself into the chair opposite. "I miss them," she said quietly. He nodded, knowing without asking. Augusta Pembroke had passed 4 winters ago, just after planting her final rosebush in the garden she once ruled with iron hands and quiet regrets. Her final months were spent reading to her grandchildren, quoting Greek philosophers between spoonfuls of apricot jam. As for Eugenia Caraway, the last Lillian had heard, she had married a baronet twice her age and moved to a provincial estate where society did not ask difficult questions. Some said she had become a recluse, others that she hosted elaborate dinners where no one laughed. Graydon remained in prison. His sentence had been reduced due to health complications, but no one had come forward to champion his release. The Fentons, stripped of their name and power, had vanished from public life, their townhouse sold at auction. History had done what it always did, forgotten some, immortalized others. But what had not faded, not once in 8 years, was the feeling that Alistair still looked at her the same way he had that morning on the Royal Crescent, as if she were the unexpected chapter in his life that had made all the others worthwhile. "You're staring," she teased, adjusting the brooch at her throat, still polished, still worn with quiet pride. "I always do," he murmured. Outside, the bells rang again, brighter now, echoing down the hills with the joy of children's laughter and distant applause. They stepped into the carriage as a family, the wind carrying the scent of cinnamon and snow through the streets. And as the wheels turned toward the hospital gates, lined with lanterns and eager faces, Lillian reached for her husband's hand. "I never thought we would build something like this," she whispered. He brought her fingers to his lips. "We didn't just build it," he said. "We earned it." And she knew as she looked into his eyes that love had not withered under the weight of years. It had grown roots deep enough to weather scandal, sorrow, and time. As the carriage crossed Pulteney Bridge once more, the river shimmered below, the sky painted in the hues of twilight and memory. The brooch caught the last rays of light, casting a golden glow against her throat. And in that glint was everything, a name once whispered, now spoken aloud, a past reclaimed, a future lived fully, together, always. Every story leaves behind more than just names and dates. It leaves behind truths we often forget to speak aloud. And The Orphan the Duke Could Not Give Away is one of those stories. It reminds us that love is not always loud, but steady, that dignity can bloom even in the shadows, and that the past, no matter how buried, does not define the worth of a soul. It only shapes the journey. Lillian and Alistair's story is a testament to what happens when we choose heart over fear, when we fight not just for justice, but for tenderness. It is a reminder that the world will always whisper, but only you can decide which voice to listen to. If you've made it all the way here, we want to know. Write the word brooch in the comments. That one word will let us know you stayed until the final moment, and that you carry this story with you, just like Lillian carried her mother's keepsake, close to the heart. If this story touched you, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of beauty in your day, please consider leaving a super thanks on this video. Whatever amount you feel called to give helps our small team continue creating these emotional, timeless journeys for you. But if that's not possible right now, you can still support us in a powerful way by sharing this story with someone who loves historical romance as much as you do. And don't leave just yet. In the video cards above, you'll find more unforgettable tales filled with love, sacrifice, and the kind of drama that stays with you long after the credits roll. Thank you for walking this path with us. Until the next story, keep believing in the power of love.